It all happened in an instant. Just a second ago, Bryce was smirking, gripping Jacob's collar, ready to humiliate him in front of the entire school. But then, a dull thud, and the school's biggest bully was on the floor, utterly confused. The cafeteria fell silent. Someone dropped their tray, and one question hung in the air. "What the hell just happened?" But what happened next turned everything upside down. Let's start from the very beginning. Jacob Harris stepped into the hallway, filled with unfamiliar faces. Graffiti-covered walls, the muffled hum of conversations, the scent of cheap deodorant mixed with cafeteria pizza. It all hit him at once. He could feel the eyes on him. There's always that moment in a new class when students size up the newcomer, and he already knew the verdict they'd give him. Too quiet, too fragile, too easy of a target. Jacob never looked for trouble. He wasn't the type to challenge anyone, didn't seek leadership, didn't try to impress. He just wanted to get through the day unnoticed, to avoid standing out, to give no reason for mockery. But people like him inevitably attract people like Bryce Miller. Bryce stood out from the moment you saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a predator's grin. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to him. There was always a group around him, those who laughed at every joke, those who fed his ego. And the moment Bryce spotted Jacob, he didn't need long to make a decision. "Weakling needs to know his place." The hallway was just narrow enough for a casual shoulder check. So he did it. Sharp, not hard enough to knock him over, but enough to make it unpleasant. Jacob jerked back, caught off guard. "Look at that! The new kid doesn't even fight back!" Bryce laughed, turning to his friends. Laughter echoed down the hall. Some chuckled, some just kept walking, pretending not to notice. "Sorry," Jacob said calmly, lowering his head slightly. But Bryce wasn't about to let him off so easily. He stepped closer, tilting his head like a shark that had smelled blood. "Did you really think that was enough?" His grin widened, his voice quieter, but somehow more dangerous. A second later, he gave Jacob a light shove to the chest. For Bryce, it was just entertainment. For the crowd, a moment of spectacle. For Jacob, it was that fleeting sensation of standing on the edge, with nothing but emptiness behind you. He staggered, barely keeping his balance. The laughter around them grew louder. Jacob felt the growing urge in his chest to disappear, to evaporate, to become invisible. But he didn't allow himself a single word, a single look. He just turned and walked away. "Weakling." The word hung in the air, even if no one had actually said it out loud. The days at school dragged on, turning into one endless trial. Jacob never had a chance to fight back. Not then, not now. Every day, Bryce and his crew found a new way to humiliate him. Sometimes it was words, sharp, corrosive, leaving invisible scars in his mind. "So, Harris, have you joined the chess club yet?" Bryce sneered, bumping into his shoulder in the hallway. "Careful, or this twig might snap," one of his friends chimed in. Other times, it was something more tangible. Once, right before gym class, they locked him in the locker room, knowing the teacher wouldn't bother looking for him. Jacob pounded on the door, but no one came. He just sat on the cold tiles, waiting until the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Another time, someone discreetly hooked their foot around his backpack strap, sending his books scattering across the hallway floor. People stepped around them, avoiding his things, but no one stopped to help. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight back. But he held himself back, because he knew, if he ever let go, everything would change. But even the most patient person eventually runs out of silent endurance. That day, school was finally over. Jacob stepped through the gates and took a breath that felt just a little lighter. At least here, he didn't have to constantly glance over his shoulder. And that's when he heard a familiar voice. "Jacob, it's been a while." He turned around. By the entrance, leaning casually against the fence, stood Mrs. Lynch. At first glance, she looked like an ordinary elderly woman. Gray hair neatly pulled into a bun, a thin face lined with gentle wrinkles. A light coat, an umbrella in hand, a faint, knowing smile. But Jacob knew better. He was looking at a legend. Mrs. Lynch was one of the best martial arts trainers in the country. It was she who had taught him from a young age control, discipline, patience. It was she who had taught him to restrain his strength, even when every part of him demanded otherwise. But now, as he stood before her, he didn't feel respect. He felt shame. He felt as though he had lost a fight he hadn't even entered. Bryce, who was just leaving the school, spotted them and burst out laughing. "What's this, weakling? Running to complain to Grandma?" His friends joined in, their laughter ringing through the air. Jacob looked at him, but said nothing. Mrs. Lynch, however, didn't look away. She studied him carefully, without judgment, without surprise. She saw it all: the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the clenched fists buried deep in his pockets. She stepped closer and said softly, "Endure." She looked him in the eyes, searching for something he had tried to forget. "You know what to do." Jacob felt something shift inside him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't despair. It was the silence before the storm. The school day followed its usual script. Classes blurred together, hallways buzzed with chatter, and Jacob, as always, tried to remain invisible. But Bryce Miller never let him just be. The cafeteria was a mess of noise, voices, clattering trays, the greasy scent of cheap hamburgers. People gathered at tables, chatting about homework, weekend plans. But at the center of it all, there was always room for entertainment. And Bryce Miller's favorite form of entertainment? Jacob Harris. Bryce stepped toward him, a smirk pulling at his lips. His friends instinctively moved aside, giving him space, giving him a stage. "Well, Harris, tired of staying silent yet?" Jacob pretended not to hear. He kept walking toward his table, but he didn't make it far. A sudden yank. His body jolted backward, the world tilting for just a second. Bryce had grabbed him by the collar, lifting him slightly off the ground before shoving him back. "Maybe it's time you show us what you're really worth, weakling." Silence spread through the cafeteria. A few people stopped chewing. Someone shifted in their seat. Everyone knew how this would end. Jacob swallowing his pride and walking away. But not this time. Jacob slowly raised his eyes. "Let me go," he said, quietly, clearly. Bryce arched a brow. "Oh, the kid speaks. Go on, do something then." He yanked him closer, ready to shove him again, but something went wrong. Before anyone could process what had happened, Jacob had already moved, fluid, precise. A sharp sidestep, a twist of the wrist, a shift of momentum, controlled, effortless. Thud. Bryce hit the floor. For a moment, he just lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, completely lost. The cafeteria froze. Somewhere a spoon clattered onto a tray. All eyes locked onto Jacob. But he didn't move. "Don't," he said simply, looking down at Bryce. Bryce pushed himself up, but the smug confidence was gone. In its place, anger. "You little—" He lunged, fist swinging, and again, he missed. Jacob was already gone, slipping aside like water through fingers. No wasted effort, no tension, just perfect precision. Bryce stumbled, a foot hooked around his ankle. Thud. He hit the floor even harder than before. The cafeteria gasped. A thick, loaded silence filled the air. Somewhere in the back, a whisper broke through. "Holy crap! What was that?" And then, out loud, the question on everyone's mind. "Jacob Harris, Who the hell trained him? Bryce couldn't believe what had just happened. He sat on the floor, one hand bracing against the ground, his chest rising and falling heavily. His ears were still ringing from the impact, but it wasn't physical pain that got to him. The real hit had landed straight on his ego. He had always been told that strength was everything. Since childhood, he had known, you either dominate or you become prey. He had never questioned that, until today. Standing before him was the person he had always thought of as weak. Jacob didn't look tired, no sign of strain, no heavy breathing, no trembling hands, just a calm, unwavering gaze. Bryce felt his fingers clench into fists. This wasn't possible. He was bigger, stronger, faster. How had this nobody done this to him? He couldn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it. "You," he muttered, but the words stuck in his throat. Jacob looked at him. His voice was steady, firm, like steel beneath the quiet. "This won't happen again." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't bravado. It was just a fact. Bryce wanted to say something. He wanted to throw another insult, to turn it into a joke, to save face somehow. But he realized he couldn't. He didn't know what to say. The crowd was looking at him differently. Before, they had laughed with him. Now, they were silent. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet. It felt like learning to stand all over again. He shook his head, but didn't meet anyone's gaze. He just turned and walked away. The cafeteria didn't move. No one stopped him. No one laughed. No one threw another insult at Jacob. They just watched. Someone looked down. Someone, for the first time, saw something different in Jacob. The crowd slowly parted for him. Jacob didn't move. He didn't need to. But no one ever called him weak again.